So Apple has seemingly nailed their new design, garnering a lot of support on their new AirPods Pro 2. This is easily the best sounding and widest feature set yet for an AirPod. Today we're going to be talking about it. Now, in fairness on these, most of the features are just upgrades to existing features, which, given how versatile it already was, is not necessarily a bad thing, but there are a couple new features that we should go over. One of them is going to be the new Find My mode, which makes this loud beeping sound so you can actually find the case. That was a common request from Apple users, and Apple, as of lately, actually seems to be listening to their users a lot more. There's also a new volume control on the side with a swipe up or down on the little stem of the unit. There is a keyring loop if you want to add this to your keychain, and an adaptive transparency mode which limits the volume of loud incoming noises. Also, a fun fact is the ear stems on this, and they have been for a while, but they're actually oval shaped. Now, I would describe the comfort of this as pretty average. This is not something that I find comfortable for more than about an hour. It starts to get kind of uncomfortable. For me, that's fairly typical. Most headphones can't last for more than an hour. These are no exception to that. Though I will say that the fitment in terms of its ability to stay in your ear is very, very good. Over the weekend, I did a pretty hard mountain bike ride and I was using these the whole time with the transparency mode on, and they didn't have to be adjusted one time outside of me just kind of scratching my ear. I took them out once, but they stayed in despite jumps, downhills, even a fall. They hold up pretty well. There's also a software mode that I didn't see on the previous generation, maybe it was there, but it can actually tell if it has a good seal or not. So you put these in your ears or someone else's, and it's actually fairly accurate. I tried to trick it a couple times and I set it purposefully to not have a good seal, and it was able to correct my error there. Now, I think for most of us headphone users, we know what a good seal sounds like, but there are people who don't. Like my parents probably wouldn't know. I'd probably have to describe it. And a software feature like this, if I was showcasing these headphones on them, I could just check it really quick before having them try the transparency mode or the spatial audio mode. And that way I know for a fact that they're getting the best version of that, because both transparency, noise cancellation, and spatial audio don't work that well without a good seal. So it's a good way to double check if you don't know what you're looking for. Okay, let's talk about that spatial audio. This works incredibly well sometimes, and is something I would turn off at other times. It really seems to depend on who is making the music. The mastering of that spatial audio track or that Dolby Atmos track, either one, really needs to be like top of the line for it to sound its best. So because of this, when you have artists converting to Dolby Atmos for previous songs, things that weren't initially created with Dolby Atmos in mind, sometimes you get this performance that is pretty lackluster for its position or its sound quality. It just doesn't seem like it fits very well with that mode. But then other songs and other tracks and other albums that were designed basically from the ground up to work with Dolby Atmos seem to work very, very well. A good example of a song that doesn't work is Pray by Sam Smith. I don't think this was initially designed to be played with Dolby Atmos, and when you play it with Dolby Atmos, it sounds very tinny and like tubular sounding. It sounds like you're kind of in this round chamber, and it doesn't sound very good. The position of the instruments in that song is okay, but not spectacular. And the stereo version I find to be far better in terms of sound quality and just general enjoyment and how it's supposed to sound like. It just sounds more accurate, I think. It's also notable that Dolby Atmos is not always supported. Now, when you're playing these with an iPhone, you can always do the head tracking stuff, spatial audio, which is a kind of an Apple adjustment of the music. And that does work no matter what you're listening to. You can even listen to something like a YouTube video. But when it comes to Dolby Atmos, a lot of tracks, most legacy albums are not recorded. So the vast majority of music out there from previous generations is not Dolby Atmos, and not all apps support Dolby Atmos. So there's a lot of times where you can't use the Dolby Atmos feature on this. It's also notable that spatial audio itself, not necessarily Dolby, but spatial audio sounds different in my experience on different apps. So switching from the same album on Tidal and going to Apple Music and using spatial audio, they actually sound a bit different. I actually found that most of the time Tidal sounded better in terms of its positioning of that spatial audio, but this was kind of hit or miss, and it was strange that it was different. Both apps sound the same, though they're at different volume levels for just regular stereo with no spatial audio. Now, spatial audio is improving, and I do think, even though we're not there yet, it is going to be the way of the future. Maybe not necessarily Apple's specific implementation, but I think when we start getting to a level where you have extremely good hardware paired with really, really, really good software, I think that's going to be pinnacle headphone territory once we get there. There are obviously companies working on that now, like Apple is trying their best to combine good hardware with good software with their new addition of their better amplifiers and their better drivers, which in terms of frequency response and my own impression actually do perform better than any previous Airpods. But I think that this is kind of just the beginning of that territory. And really good headphones that have good sound staging still sound wider than this does. But when you're talking about IEMS that are Bluetooth, this thing performs very, very well. Last couple notes on features and software. The switching between devices, if you have an Apple laptop or an Apple TV, an Apple computer or a phone, this will do an automatic switch if you go to use something else. It'll ask if you want to reconnect to the different thing. On the previous version, this was a somewhat slower process for me. I couldn't always get it to work correctly or quickly or at all sometimes. This seems to be much more consistent, though there are a couple times where it doesn't work that well. But it's been a much faster, smoother process going from device to device to device than previous versions at least. Now, this would be an extremely niche use case, and I doubt that Apple will do it because they really don't like to play outside of what they think your walled garden should look like. But a feature that I wish they would add is turning this in future generations into a DAC so that you could use this with other non-Bluetooth devices, plug in USB for audio, and then this would actually be the transmitter for the Bluetooth if you wanted to. That way you could, for example, game on a Windows computer with the spatial audio. I have no proof that it would be really cool, but I imagine it would sound really, really awesome. And just using this as a charging station for the headphones and your transmitter for your spatial audio and Bluetooth, I think would be so sick. Don't think they will add that, but I'd love to see it. Then you have the sound quality of these. Now, the sound quality is a little bit tricky because you kind of get two headphones in one. You get the non-spatial audio version and the spatial audio version. And honestly, which one sounds better is really just a matter of trial and error. Some songs sound better without it. Some songs sound better with the spatial audio. So it really just depends song to song to song. I actually don't mind this. This might be annoying to some users, and I think some users are just going to set one setting and just leave it there. But I really like the experimentation. I like turning it off, one time through the song and then re-listening with the spatial audio on. I like that. But it does make reviewing it somewhat difficult. I want to start with probably the worst aspect of this and then go to possibly the best aspect of this. I don't love the mid-range. It's not totally convincing for me, despite a improved frequency response compared to previous generations. I don't think the mids are forward enough in the correct way. They have a decent bit of lower mid-range forwardness. There's a little bit of a boost in that area actually, and a fairly competent upper mid-range, but the delivery of it just doesn't seem as isolated and as forward-focused as I would like, or is separated from the background instruments with the spatial audio off. Now, when you turn it on, you gain that separation, and the separation becomes very, very good, probably class leading actually. But the problem with it is that it boosts the upper mid-range. It makes it sound a little bit too bright and a little bit too tinny for a lot of airier vocalists. Like if you're gonna listen to Sia or Adele, some of those notes that they're singing can be very, very sharp actually on this headphone with the spatial audio. Now, if you're listening to more deeper vocalists, somebody with a little bit more body to their voice and not so much airiness in the top end, this is not a problem. And it's actually very, very good for those vocalists. But again, this is one of those areas that I think is a little bit of a hit and a little bit of a miss, depending on which artist and which song and which mode of the headphone. Treble response for the price is actually fairly good. I think that the timbre could use a little bit of a tweaking. I think things like metallics and strings sound a little bit unnatural, but largely this seems like an improvement from previous generations. Resolution, I would qualify as like just okay. It's at that level where it's passable, it's acceptable, but it's not class leading. And there are headphones that do it much, much better, like the C Audio Midnight is a good example. Okay, two areas that I find very impressive about the sound are bass response and sound staging, and they sort of actually go hand in hand here. Now, what I don't find that I find a lot of times in Bluetooth headphones or in IEMs is bass that sounds impactful and gives you a sense of scale and environment. Typically, this is reserved for very, very good IEMs or very, very good headphones for the bass response where they seem large for scale. But with spatial audio on, I actually think that the bass response coming out of here is excellent in terms of environmental information. It's still got a classically like punchy Apple response where it sounds very quick and very vivid and very saturated in the bass response, though I think they've cleaned up a little bit of the mid-bass bloat. Sub-bass performance is very good for an IEM, though there is a little bit of a frequency difference, it sounds like, between the spatial audio and the non-spatial audio for bass response. I think the non-spatial audio hits a little bit harder in the sub-bass region, and the spatial audio seems to be a little bit less, though still pretty good. In terms of detail of the bass response, this is actually one of the more impressive areas. I actually feel like the AirPod Max was very good with sub-bass detail, and I feel like these are very good with sub-bass detail as well. Bass has always been something that Apple does better than a lot of their other ranges like mid-range and treble response, but I feel like this is, again, an improvement over the previous generation, and actually for the money, it sounds really, really good. So sound staging. If you get the right tracks with spatial audio, this is some of the best sound staging performance you will get on a Bluetooth headphone of this category. Even a wired headphone of this price, this is still up there for sound staging performance. I think right here, they're taking a couple liberties for accuracy of the positioning of the instruments compared to like what the original track is supposed to look like. But I think if you forego what you think it's supposed to sound like and just enjoy the presentation and the end result that you're getting, I do think this is a very, very enjoyable headphone for sound staging presentation. And I think it does a very good job of not only placing sounds in different environments, but actually having a very complete orb of sound in terms of positioning all around your head. It's very good at throwing things all the way behind you. It's very good at throwing things far out in front of you, above you. It's just very good in a lot of different sound placements. And I think that that versatility, even though it's mostly software, is an impressive part of this headphone. But I think the bottom line here is that it does take a good recording that seems to work well with the spatial audio and the sound adjustments that it makes. Okay, so when all things are considered for functionality, I think the general consensus of the wider world out there and myself is that this is well worth the money for the feature set and the sound quality if all things are considered. If you're just into features and not so much into sound quality, or you don't care as much as you do for the features, you can get a very similar feature set for about $179, saving $60 with the AirPods Pro generation number 1. If you don't need a couple of the extra features that this has. Just on features or just on sound alone, I don't think that this stands at $230 or $240 as being worth it. But if you're gonna use all the features and you want good sound quality in one package, I do think that this thing is definitely worth the money. So I will drop a link to everything that I talked about down in the description below, the Midnights, the 2s, the 1s, and maybe even some of its competitors if you wanna check those out. Okay guys, thanks a lot for watching. See you guys next time. Bye.